Let's open in a word of prayer and we'll get started in this final lesson. Heavenly Father, thank you for the time we spend together. Thank you for the word that you give us, that you don't give us all the answers, that you keep things and hold things and provide things, but we're so thankful for what you do provide. Help us to use it to strengthen our faith and to understand your role of your Messiah in this world. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to try to get through chapters 7 through maybe part of 11 today. We did a little bit 11 before. But just a quick review, because we may not get to the review at the end, because I always run out of time. But think about just a couple of, these are the thoughts or the takeaways, the big takeaways that I had from these chapters. In Genesis chapter 3, which was the fall, we kind of learned that, based upon Adam and Eve's experience, that what we should think about, or how we should think, is that our joy is not rooted in being like God, but being with God. That being with God is the most important thing. Knowing Him and walking with Him, not trying to have answers for everything all the time. But we tend to want to be like God. We want to be gods ourselves. We want to determine good ourselves. That's the takeaway from chapter 3. From chapter 4, with the story of Cain and Abel and Cain's offspring and their desire for the things of the world, pleasure and security and the like, that people would rather walk away from God than take His counsel. This is the big takeaway, I think, from chapter 4. Chapter 5 is the genealogy of Seth, which is the genealogy of the Messiah. And I think the most important takeaway from that is that God will intervene in His creation to ensure that He will bring forth the Messiah who will reconcile the world back to where He intended it to be, which is also the book of Revelation, right? It's the final culmination of that. But Genesis 5 tells you, because the specificity in chapter 5 versus chapter 4 tells you that God's got this in control. He knows how many years people are living, and when their offspring is going to come, and it's all marching down the path of bringing forth Jesus as Messiah. And that's a significant thing. And so when we go into the next set of Calibrate classes, they're all about the Messiah, preparation for the Messiah, the providence of the Messiah, the promise of the Messiah, as we work through that exciting part of what the Bible tells us. And then chapter 6, which we did last week, is that this is the beginning of the flood, the preparation for the flood. And what we really know is that God is patient, but judgment is inevitable. And then the sideline to that, and the secondary, is people still love their liberty more than they love God. And there are certain things, we've talked about the fact that the world, not to think about the world the same way throughout all periods of time in the past, that God deals with the world maybe in a different way. He deals with the spiritual world in a different way throughout the past and throughout time. But one thing is constant, and that's that the people are the same. People are still basically sinners, And yet, God loves His creation so much that He gives us what we desire. This is a God who loves us and therefore gives you what you want. The problem is, we don't really understand the consequences of what it is we want. And we dig our own hole most of the time. And so there's a lot of good, I think, big picture takeaways. But we get into now, as we're moving into chapter 7, which is the flood story itself, you got to ask this question: how bad does it have to get for God to destroy the entire world and all the people and all the land animals and all the birds? You notice He doesn't necessarily destroy all the fish, but He destroys all the land animals, all the birds, all the people. How bad does it have to get? And so this is interesting. So in chapter 6, verse 5, it says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. It was time. Judgment. God is patient. He wants people to come to love him on their own. But it got pretty bad at this point. He goes on in this was basically the end of the prep part, and then chapter 6 goes into the story of Noah in a little more detail, and it repeats again. But this time it says, God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their ways upon the earth. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, and the earth is filled with violence because of them. And behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. That's a pretty bad state of affairs. But notice there's a little bit difference in the term. So in 6:5, it's man's ugly. In 6:12, it's all flesh. And all flesh could mean anything basically that's living. And we're not talking trees and plants. They may be biologically alive, but in God's definition, they're not living. They don't have breath of life in them. And so we have this transition to all flesh. And so I'm not going to tell you the answer here because I'm not sure I know it. But when you ask the question, how bad does it have to get? You read a couple of these passages, you say, well, the thoughts of people are evil continually, and that's bad enough for God to destroy the world. But look at this statement in Genesis chapter 8, which is after the flood. He says, I'll never again curse the ground because of man. So maybe the ground is not as cursed as it was before. We may talk about that a little bit. He says, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. So nothing has changed in man's heart. So why did God destroy the world? It's a really hard question to answer, and the Bible doesn't give us that answer. Now, personally, I think it helps to support the view of angels outside of their dominion and weird biological things happening now between the offspring, right? The Nephilim. I mean, it helps to support that. Again, you can't necessarily be dogmatic on that perspective, although I think a lot of the evidence will lead you in that direction, and it is kind of the natural reading of the text that there was weird stuff going on between the spiritual and the physical worlds at that time. And so you gotta, so when you use the term all flesh now, all flesh can include any of those kinds of creatures and ideas as it gets bigger and wider, that something really, really bad has happened. And so, but
in light of the fact that, as you talked in previous class, that animals and those type of things aren't afraid of man, could that be some kind of component? Is this also?
Well, yeah, I think it's all flesh, right? So this would indicate that even the animals now are sinning, which is a weird construction because when you think about their ability they don't have a spiritual capability. They don't have the ability to ask why. They have the ability to do who, what, where, and when, right? They have a mental capacity, but they don't have that spiritual sense, that image of God that was given to man, that was not, they had the nephesh, or the soul, they have the mind, they have intellect, emotion, and will at varying degrees depending on the animal. But they don't have that image of God, that ability. The easiest way I think about it, the ability to ask why, the ability to dive deeper into the philosophical or the religious or the belief. They just act. You can do a lot of things with who, what, when, and where.
Their programming change.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to look at it. I mean, that's a decent way to look at it. Their animals are a lot more instinctive, although that doesn't mean they're not emotional. I mean, nobody who owns a dog or a cat or any kind of animal, when they scream in pain, is not, some form of an emotional, not to the extent that we deal with ours, not very well most of the time. but there is that difference. So yeah, all flesh includes the animals, without a doubt. This would include all of them, and I would contend it might also include whatever this offspring Nephilim were.
It also could be referring that maybe the animals are more aggressive or hostile, perhaps, to human beings. That could also be considered to be something else.
Yeah, it could be. There could be some of that transition of the like, albeit that it isn't until after the flood that God says, now the animals will fear you. But before they probably didn't. But it doesn't mean that some weird things were happening.
And maybe man was using animals in the wrong way, or maybe they're using their rule or their control over them in a hostile, in a sinful way. Then
and they're getting a reaction.
That separated and crushed the interaction and the relationship we have between the animal kingdom and us, and that they no longer respected us, they no longer feared us because of maybe pre-flood instincts or pre-flood action.
Could be, although all those animals were killed.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
The instincts kicked in.
Maybe, yeah, it's possible. We don't know a lot of those answers, right? But you have to at least come to grips with the world was different then. We don't know what all the differences may have been, and we can speculate a lot, and it's good to speculate. It's fun because it's just good. Were you gonna?
Yeah, I was just gonna say part of this kind of I feel like goes into the whole time as far as like how long Earth has been around, because if it was, let's say 4,000 years, 3,000 years until the flood, or whatever time frame, I mean, there comes a point after a certain amount of time where like men get to that point where if you look at the flood, between the flood and now, we're about the same roughly. I mean, we're 7,000 or 8,000. I mean, speculatively, 7,000 or 8,000 years.
Yeah, there seems to be some significant event that happens every 1,000 years or so,
yeah,
right? Or 2,000 years. And there's a lot of good stuff you can do
also
with time frame.
I mean, when he says this, God also knows that there will be a time when the end will come. I mean,
there will be a future judgment. I mean, he says at the end of the flood, he says, I will not again I will not again destroy the world by flood. Okay? So he's going to use fire next time, right?
There's more elements.
Right.
Never say the word, please.
That in the end, it will be like the days of Noah.
Right. It'd be like, except instead of a flood, it'll be a fire. It'll be by heat, right? And fire. So yeah. So it's the point to take away is there will be a point in which God says, okay, it's time. And I would contend it has to be pretty bad. Because God so loves the world, and He is patient, not wanting any to, fall away, but all to come to repentance, right? I mean, and you'll hear some more about that from John. So now we move into the story of Noah. Noah's found to be the only person righteous, not his sons or his daughters. They weren't determined to be righteous. Noah had favor in God's sight, and God tells Noah to build an ark in Kentucky. Well, okay, not.
That's great.
Yeah, that's the ark in Kentucky. Just so you know,
Kentucky.
That's the Answers in Genesis ark are just used for. How many of y'all have ever been to the ark? Have you been to it, or the Creation Museum? Yeah. So my wife and I, we're founding members of Creation Museum, and so we've been there many times, but haven't been to the ark yet. And everybody who goes says it's very, very worthwhile trip. And anyways, ark's huge, lots of animals. The estimate is there's lots of room for 2 of every kind and room for all their food. It's not a problem. It's not really an issue. Now,
Where did they go to the bathroom?
Well, they would go right there. There's plumbing.
There's no plumbing there.
Yeah, there's something. Actually, Noah's lived in a separate section.
Yes, exactly.
That had air conditioning.
Yeah, you would pray.
Yeah. Anyways, bigger than a football field, taller than 3-story building, 3 levels, lots of room. Took them 100 years to build. Okay, so this is not an insignificant craft. And then as we walk into the flood itself, God brings the animals to Noah, but they also obey Noah in going into the ark. There's that linkage there between them. Yes, how did the animals come? Well, animals lived a different world back then than they do now, and lots of big things happened. And I think the most significant thing to think about is most of the time, especially when we were kids, when we were taught the Noah story, with the cute little animals and the prancing, does and stuff, is the focus was on the rain. But that's only half of the story. It's the fountains of the great deep and the floodgates of the skies. It's not just the rain, it's the fountains of the great deep. So I'm going to kind of walk you through just a little video. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me." And the Lord closed up the ark. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. The rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. The flood came upon the earth for 40 days, and the water increased and lifted up the ark, so it rose above the earth. The water prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. All flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts and every swarming thing that swarms on the earth, and all mankind. Of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, died. From man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the ark, and only Noah was left, together with those that were with him in the ark. The waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. I like that. Now, again, we don't know everything that happened, this artist's depiction of the possibilities, but I like it because it puts emphasis on the fountains of the great deep. We tend, like always, we tend to take what we understand in our current world and superimpose things backwards, right? And so we understand rain, so we say, oh, it must have been some really bad rains. But the fountains of the great deep, this is not an insignificant statement, and it's used more than once within the text. Because he not only opened the fountains of the great deep, at the end he shut the fountains of the great deep. So they were open for that period of 40 days and 40 nights. This is not insignificant. And if those fountains were at the lowest part of the crust of the earth, when it breaks open, you would have magma and flowing volcano stuff pouring through the waters, turning it all into mist and vapor, which would go up into the atmosphere and just come down as rain and change the whole atmospheric condition. And whether there was a canopy above the earth before that keeps the rain over, or whether the earth was tilted on its axis different, there's a lot of speculation you can make about the scientific things that could have caused some of this stuff to happen. And in the end, those are all good, but we know this was bad. This was a significant event. Now, a lot of people will try to tell you, this is very common, that you can believe in the flood, but it was just a local event. Right? It's just a local event. And I think you can get there from the text. So let me tell you how you would interpret the text in order to make the flood local. You would take words like all and everything, which God uses over and over again to and you would put them in their hyperbolic sense. It would be hyperbole or exaggeration. So like for me, I said, Becky and I, we went to the all-you-can-eat buffet, and I ate it all. And then most of you would say, oh, no, that's true. But I didn't actually eat it all. I ate all I could. Right? I used that word in an exaggerated sense, which we do all the time. And so you could take the text and say these are that these were exaggerated in the sense that the all is just what Moses or Noah knew about the world, the part of the world that they lived in, that it was very regional. So you can get there from the text. However, it would not be the most straightforward reading of the text, because God emphasizes over and over and over and over and over and over and over again that it's everything. It's the highest mountains. This is everywhere on the earth, everywhere, And then what's interesting, and then the part I think that you have to struggle with as a Christian in believing this, is the statement at the end when God tells Noah that he's not going to, that he will never again destroy the earth by flood. And he gives him that covenant. If it was just a local flood, we still have local floods today that destroy portions of the world. So that would make God a liar. Because we still have local floods that destroy portions of the world.
And then your argument has to be where local, because I think almost every single continent's or major country's origin stories somewhat have a flood story.
They all have a flood story. We talked about that at the end of last week.
Yeah.
That every major civilization has creation story. Every major civilizations have demigod stories. Every major civilizations have flood stories. They all do. They all have some varying elements of it, but all the pieces.
So what local
are there.
flood? Which one?
Yeah. So we're going to spend the rest of this class on geology.
Woo! Rocks. It rocks.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
You wanted to use that quick.
Yeah.
And he took it from you.
No, it's
Right?
okay.
Yeah.
I'm good with that. And so, because you can read the text of the flood story, and it's pretty intense. God gives it 2 full chapters of what's going on. As a result of that judgment, and it's hard to walk away from that text saying that the world wasn't destroyed, and that it wasn't a very, very significant, event. And so, if it was, then you would expect to see some evidence of that, right? And interestingly enough, let's talk about geological theories. The Noah's flood theory was the geological theory up until the early 1700s, until the Age of Enlightenment. And I don't know how familiar you are with the Age of Enlightenment, and modernity is another name for that. But that, that's what brought, to some extent, the American Revolution, followed right by the French Revolution. And especially for the French Revolution, a lot of that was driven by the fact that the church in France and the state of France got too close, and they wanted to destroy both of them. Right? People they were tired of that. And now in France, it was the Catholic Church that ran France, but in England, it was the Church of England that was linked with the king. Right, and why did people come to America? Because they didn't like, anytime the church and the state become one or become too close, it's a problem, and it's a problem all through history. Right, it over and over and over and over again through history. It is a problem when the church and the state are the same entity, right? And people push back on it. All of the Enlightenment and modernity push towards this idea that we don't need, we need some governance, but we don't need the church involved with it. And what we need to do is get rid of the church, And we can get rid of the church by destroying the mythologies of the early sections of the Bible. Right? So Noah's flood was the answer that all of these sedimentary rock layers. Do you remember the three kinds of rocks? Igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic, right? So igneous rocks are rocks that come directly from magma.
I'm impressed by me.
Yeah. I'm impressed by you too. But igneous rocks are rocks that are formed straight from magma, right? Either coming up and being cooled, or coming out of a volcano and being cooled. And so lots of different types of igneous rocks. Granite is an igneous rock. Basalt is an igneous rock. Lots of igneous rock. And then sedimentary rocks are rocks that are obliterated igneous rocks that are turned into sand and dust and then smashed back together again. Okay? They're sediments. They're made out of sediments, made out of sand or mud or whatever that flows. And then metamorphic rocks are either igneous rocks or sedimentary rocks, mostly sedimentary rocks, under pressure and heat, change into a harder substance. So, we have like sandstones and stuff like that, but then, I've heard of slate that they use for roofs. So slate's a metamorphic rock. It's a much harder rock, but it's transformed or metamorphosized like a butterfly, right? It's changed through heat and pressure. So you got these three kinds of rocks, and the whole world is covered with sedimentary rock layers. Where do sedimentary rock layers come from?
The sand and dust.
They come from, most of the time they come from water laying down and erosion. Right? And so the question you have to struggle with when we start talking about this, you got Noah's flood, you got catastrophist theory, you got uniformitarian theory, and then Pangea, we'll talk really quickly about as a subset of uniformitarianism. But up until about 1700, the Noah's flood perspective of geology was the perspective of geology. So some catastrophists come in as part of modernity. These would still be guys that would be solid, church guys, but they're now starting to look at having time to look at the science or look at the observations of the world in which we live. And what they're seeing is you got these sedimentary rock layers that seem to just show up on top of each other. There's no transition between them. There's a very hard line between them. That something had to have happened in order to put the next layer down. That it couldn't be, and we were also starting to do paleontology by that time and finding dinosaur bones and other fossils. And you find, there's a whole bunch of fossils in this layer, and there's a whole bunch of fossils in this layer, but there's nothing in between. And so they developed this theory called catastrophism, which says that there was a series of major catastrophic worldwide events, both local and worldwide, throughout history, floods or meteors or any other things that at multiple times in the history of the earth had laid down certain layers on top of each other. It actually wasn't a bad way to explain the fact that you find fully formed fossils in a layer and then nothing, and then fully formed fossils in a layer that are different types of fossils and the like. It's not a bad way to explain it. These guys, and then came along some of these guys, uniformitarian guys. Now, we don't have time to do a whole class on these guys, and there's a lot more than just the two I put up there, but these are the two most important of them. Both these guys grew up in the church, had bad experiences with the church, and hated the church. And they would have been at best deists. There's a lot of deists in the early part of the because people wanted to put a foot on both camps. You couldn't stay out of the church if you wanted to work, right? But you didn't have to be. So like Thomas Jefferson was a deist. A lot of our founding fathers were deists. And a deist basically says that God created the world, but then he hasn't done anything since. He just steps out and he lets everything just happen because of the way he created it. And so if you take away the God part, because you don't need God, and if you're a deist, you don't actually need God, right? You can just go all the way to being a naturalist, or naturalism. And naturalism is a philosophy. And naturalism is a philosophy that says, I have to be able to explain everything without the need for God's intervention. Everything has to be able to be explained naturally without any supernatural intervention. Well, if you get rid of supernatural intervention, what do you get rid of? Get rid of God. You can call yourself a deist, but you've also gotten rid of creation. You've also gotten rid of a judgment by flood specifically at a specific time. Okay? And Charles Lyell publishes a set of books in 1830 called Principles of Geology, which Darwin took with him on the Beagle when he went around to do some of his studies. These two guys ended up being lifelong friends. They were in cahoots with each other, and they even wrote letters to each other telling each other how easy it was to destroy the foundations of the Bible with the philosophies that they pushed forward. But nobody wants to show you those pieces, right? Because I just ask you, why would you believe in a scientific theory that purposefully ignores God or God's intervention?
Well, even if not that, that purposely ignores at least the possibility, because
Right.
if you're a
There's
true
no possibility.
scientist, you embrace at least initially every possibility.
And that's kind of what these guys
They're a
did.
warped guys are, because they're trying to disprove something. They're not trying to show actual knowledge.
And so that's what these guys were kind of that way. They basically said that Noah's flood was the last of the catastrophes.
So basically, so I was going to ask this earlier. Catastrophists, they aren't completely off, but are they? But they're just like going in a different, more a dangerous direction in terms of.
Yeah, they started to undermine the biblical account that gave the foothold for the naturalists
They
to come
opened
in.
the Pandora's
They-
box.
Right, they opened the Pangea box.
But I would say the reason why these guys came along is so that they could become God, that they don't have to be adherent to a higher power, so that this gives them an excuse to check out.
I'm not sure I would go that far with them, but I would go as far to say that they had no problem undermining the church.
Mm-hmm. They didn't have to be beholden to the church.
Right, they didn't want that. I mean, anyways, that's a whole nother
They
story.
sold books.
Yeah, huh? And they sold a lot of books,
I mean,
and they
just like
became
today, you started
right.
weird
And-
theory, and
right.
you have all these people
right.
following.
And
you,
Charles
they make money.
Lyell, he was a lawyer. He was good at writing briefs, so he could make a case. But and Lyell's stuff was interesting, but it wasn't in the forefront of the thinking in the mid-1800s until Darwin came out with his theory. Because what Darwin needed for evolution is old Earth time. He needed time. Noah's flood and catastrophism doesn't give you time, because there's no way to know how long or how old. But uniformitarianism basically says this, and this is the basis of all geology books today. When you were a kid and had a geology class, it was based upon uniformitarian thought. The present is the key to the past. The processes that we see today have to be the same exact processes that have gone on forever and ever and ever into the past. Slow erosion lays down sediments. We can measure the erosion rate today. We can now apply that to the amount of sediments we have, and we get a millions of year old Earth. It's quite simple. It's not science. It's the interpretation of evidence based upon a worldview. But we have been led to believe that it's actual science. But if anything has taught you anything in this past year with COVID, right, is everybody had the same science. But their interpretation of that science was based upon their worldview, and we had two totally different ways to interpret it. That's what's going on here. they're trying, there's a purposeful intent to mislead. And Darwin needed long amounts of time. Uniformitarianism and Lyell gave him that. And then the two together became now the reason why everybody could go away from, and then turn all of the Bible in early stories of the Bible into mythology.
I mean,
Because
essentially
mythology
they created
can't-
their own religion.
Well, to some extent, yes. I mean, naturalism is a philosophy that is religious in, all philosophies are religious in nature because it determines what you believe. And you got four major ones besides biblical Christianity. You got the naturalism, humanism, dualism, and universalism. And then lots of combinations of those give you all the different things we have today. But those are the four basic ones. And so, why would you believe somebody's interpretation of scientific data if they're interpreting it to make sure it fits with their philosophy? Doesn't make sense to me. All right, we're going to skip Pangea, only from the perspective that it's stupid. But then I fall into the same problem everybody else has. So let me just tell you, think about Pangea this way. Pangea works well if the Earth is flat.
Oh, the flat earthers.
Right.
Flat earthers.
What's going on the other side of the world if there's a supercontinent? It's all water. Well, what do we know about water and the moon and tides? We would have a lopsided Earth that would wobble, right? And it just wouldn't, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Could we have multiple supercontinents?
Well, no, but you could, but that's not the theory,
Okay.
okay? The theory is,
One big Earth.
here's the silliest part about the theory, right? The theory came about because somebody said, hey, it looks like this part of Africa fits, that this
Yeah.
fits right up in there. Well, it does, because there's a giant crack in the Earth's surface between those two plates, right? And so think about it this way. If you had a balloon and it was covered with a thin layer of plaster Paris, and you blew a little bit into the balloon, what would happen? It would break into big chunks in order to relieve the pressure, and it would break at the thinnest points. The thinnest points of the Earth's crust would be the lowest parts where of the ocean or the water, because water goes to a nice, water equalizes everything. This is a plate. It's not the continent. There just happens to be water there. And so as soon as you break open the fountains of the great deep, you have tons of material thrown out. Now, once that stops, all that material around those cracks is gone. And so as the world settles back in, what happens? It settles back lower along the cracks. And then where does the water go? To the low part. So now, whether the continents looked like that before the flood or not, I don't know, but I don't think Pangea is the answer. Pangea came about because of uniformitarianism, that they said, hey, we're seeing some slight movements, like 3 millimeters per year or per 10 years or something, but on some of these fault lines, right? That there's some movement. So then the uniformitarian theology says, oh, well, if I say that's been the same rate of movement, how old is the Earth? And they get millions of years. You can get millions of years out of that. But it's based upon an assumption that the processes are all the same. And so they say, well, how long would it take then for these two things to come apart? And now it supports your uniformitarian theory about naturalism. And you got old age, old Earth stuff. And everybody thinks it's science. And it's not science, it's religion.
Also, these land masses, we're not on an island.
No, but interestingly
the
enough,
land goes all the way down.
right,
to
yeah,
Earth's-
right.
I mean,
But and the water just goes to the water makes the but look, it seems the land masses end up being kind of in the center of these big plates. Why? Because the plates, once the fountains of the great deep stop bursting forward, there's less material there now, and so when it cools back down, it's going to crush back down. So all God has to do to make Noah's flood is increase the temperature of the core of the Earth by a couple degrees, That's going to force the whole Earth to expand. Boom.
Somebody messed with the thermostat again.
Right. Yeah. And anyways, so I didn't mean to do that because now we can't get to any of this because we're already
We
done.
can't just talk fast.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to be able to get to all these, but I'm going to give you these. There are 6 things. I'll go through them as fast as I can. But there are, if there was a worldwide flood that destroyed, that just pulverized rock and magma and igneous rocks, just pulverized it because of the water and the light, then you would expect to have mud flows and just giant mud tsunamis and lahars and all kinds of geological activity that would have laid down sediment. Right? And we have that. We can now trace, chemically sediment and sediment layers throughout entire continents. And that's a lot of sediment. That's not a local flood. That's a big old chunk. You look at the Grand Canyon, and what's interesting is all of this rock down here is almost all igneous rock, right? Except for this little chunk here, but and then all above it is all sedimentary rock. And they call this interface the great unconformity because they don't know how to explain it. Oops. But the flood explains it easily, that this is the world before the flood, and as a result of the flood, you have layers and layers of sedimentary rocks. Just imagine the water churning back and forth on the surface of the earth and dropping down layers. You also can't, how do you explain, if your layers are done over a small, little bit over millions of years of time, how do you explain folded rock layers, right?
The erosion got a little weird that day.
Yeah, but if all these layers were laid down, they were still reasonably soft, and then it upheavaled again, you could easily see how you could get those types of things. My favorite one's Mount St Helens, 1980, and this changed my perspective significantly. So Mount St Helens blows its top in 1980, and then again in 1982. And 2 really wonderful people went to visit it in 1994 or 1990, in that time frame. And so you can still see where all the trees were just blown over and wiped out. Now we're on this side, but if you look at it from this view, so now we're over here, what you see is all of the debris from the mountain filled in this valley. This is all new material that has been built up. And we know this because we know, we had enough survey data from before and afterwards to know how much is new material and how much, where the old stuff was. And if you notice, what do you notice right there? 2 big canyons. Right? Now, here's so guys in the canyon, they're standing right about here, looking up to this side. What do you see? All of the rock here in this canyon was laid down by Mount St Helens in the 1980 and the 1982 eruption. All of it, from here all the way to the top. What does it look like? Sedimentary. It looks like sedimentary rock layers, just like the Grand Canyon, but on a much broader scale. And if you had this picture in your geology book, what would they say? They would say, this little creek down here ran through this for millions of years to erode this canyon. But we know, we have observational data that says this canyon was made in a day. The ground was still wet and soft, and after a pretty good sized rain, there was a giant mud flow called the lahar, where the earth gave way and formed this canyon out, and everything just kind of went downhill and formed these 2 canyons in a day. This is hard to, now take that and expand it to a whole earth, and you got,
So that's not igneous, that's not lava.
That's all
created.
sedimentary. That's all sedimentary rock layers.
Mud.
Yeah, because when the mountain blows its type, it obliterates all the igneous rock into dust, into pumice and dust, and right. You see the clouds. when you see the clouds coming out of a volcano, it's not clouds, it's dirt.
It's dirt, dust, and sulfur.
It's solid. It's not solid, it's obliterated solids, right? Same with coal seams. You get coal seams and petroleum products, all that stuff come from the fact that if you covered the whole earth and wiped it out, all of the vegetation floats, and all that vegetation tends to mass together when there's any kinds of winds. We saw some of that in Mount St Helens, and then you get another big wave of dirt and mud come over it, buries it. Now you got a bunch of organic material smashed together in in between rock layers, and that allows you to have enough pressure and heat to turn it all into coal. But in your textbooks they say, oh well, little stuff, peat fell down from the swamp, and over millions of years grew up. Now that could happen, but it could also happen this way too. And you have the whole idea of fossils, which how many of y'all have been down to Mammoth, the Mammoth National Park in Waco? You gotta go. So these are mammoth fossils in Waco.
That's really cool.
And what else is with them? It's either here. It's a camel.
What?
They got camel fossils in Waco. Okay, this is just really cool stuff. We don't have time to talk all about fossils, but if you think about it, fossils only form if they're buried quickly. If they're not buried quickly, if they die and stay on top and wait for sediment to cover them up, they get eaten first.
And they decompose fast.
Right, they decompose, they get eaten, they don't get. You have to bury a dead animal in order to make it into a fossil, and
quickly.
we're not going to talk about. But here's another good one. So here's a whole series of sedimentary rock layers, and here's a tree trunk fossil that goes in between them all. Okay, how can you have a tree trunk fossil if it takes millions of years for each one of these layers?
That is.
Well, I don't know. And then the most important one, the one I think is the most interesting one, is we've been collecting dinosaur bones for a long time, since the since the mid 1700s. It's just been a drive for that. And there's tons of dinosaur bones in all these museums and in the basements of all these universities. And now they're starting to look at them and cut some of them open, and they're finding inside fossils of dinosaur bones organic material that has not been fossilized. Collagen and blood cells
DNA.
and things. DNA, yeah. Jurassic Park,
Dun, dun, dun.
right? And this is fairly recent stuff, and you can't. So you have a dinosaur bone that you've set at 70 million years old. That is no way it could be that, because
organisms.
the organism would never, 300,000 years max is the estimate from the same scientists, right? So anyways, fun stuff. And then you got the final aftermath, new Earth, new world.
The Ice Age is biblical.
The Ice Age would potentially have easily been explainable based upon a pressure change and you got all this moisture, you got all this aftermath for the flood. You have a change in pressure. How many of y'all have an air compressor? When you let the pressure out of your air compressor, what happens? Ice crystals form on the
And the sun not being blocked out for a little while.
Right, and so you can easily, there's some really good scientific papers done on the fact that depending on what the changes were in the atmosphere after the flood, the Ice Age would have been an easy thing, but only one, not a whole bunch of, because uniformitarianism requires you have multiple ones over many billions of years. Okay, we have gone way too long.
Can I ask one?
Yes.
One question?
Yes.
Real quick, so, did the flood kill the dinosaurs, or was it? What happened?
Well, the flood killed all the dinosaurs except the 2 or the 4 or the 8 or whatever that were on the ark. Now the question is, what's a dinosaur, and do we still have dinosaurs today? And And they may very well be, dinosaurs may very well be lizards that grew to live to be 800 years old. But that's a whole different,
Yeah, we
that's
don't-
another
no,
topic of
no.
discussion, and I can't do.
I'm just-
So bottom
I don't know
line,
what happened to the
how
dinosaurs.
bad does it have to get for God to judge the world? And secondly, the evidence of the flood is all around us, and yet we still don't want to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Heavenly Father, thanks for this class and for the word that you give us, and bless us now as we go forth. In Jesus' name, amen.